Good morning, comrades. I'm speaking about China and Korea. We've all seen over the past 6 months the Trump administration has been obsessed with Korea. The bully-in-chief has even threatened a nuclear war against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the socialist northern half of the country. Of course, it's not just Trump. The Pentagon has been threatening the DPRK ever since the end of World War II, more than 70 years ago. So if you'll permit me, I will give a little historical background here, because most people in the United States really know next to nothing about Korea. And what they're being told every day is that the 25 million people of the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, are held captive by an irrational, by an irrational dictatorship that wants to start a nuclear war with the U.S. Well, of course, that's bullshit. So let's talk about the history so that you are armed with facts when you go back and you speak to your fellow workers and your fellow students and your neighbors and so on. Under both the Democrat Truman and the Republican Eisenhower, the U.S. imperialists waged a horribly destructive war against this small country, the DPRK, for 3 years, 1950 to 53. The U.S. sent almost 7 million troops to Korea, most of them draftees. More than 40,000 of those U.S. soldiers never came back. 33,000 of them were killed. The rest disappeared. In that war, both People's China and the USSR supported the DPRK. A son of Mao Zedong was killed in the war, one of the million Chinese soldiers who fought on the side of the DPRK. And millions of Koreans died, both soldiers and civilians. Right now, the U.S. imperialists have dropped their full-court press against Korea, at least in public, right? Even though U.S. ships, submarines, and planes continue to threaten the DPRK, the screaming headlines have tapered off for now. So what's happened? Well, all the bluster and threats didn't work. The DPRK has not agreed to give up its nuclear defense. And China has not, quote, solved the Korea problem for Trump, as he kept saying it would. There was so much speculation in the U.S. imperialist media that Trump would be able to drive a wedge between China and the DPRK. And indeed, China did join the U.S. in UN resolutions imposing sanctions on Korea. And we don't agree with that at all. As long as the U.S. maintains its huge arsenal of nukes, capable of blowing up the whole world many times over, those countries that the imperialists target for regime change have the right to defend themselves by any means necessary. But after Trump went to Beijing and met with Xi Jinping, all the talk about China helping the U.S. disarm the DPRK, it suddenly has evaporated from the media. It's really a victory for the Korean people's right to self-determination. The Koreans are a distinct people who were united for thousands of years by language, culture, and geography. People in both the North and the South yearn for reunification of their country. But since 1945, Korea has been divided between a capitalist South and a socialist North. So how did this happen? Well, if you don't mind, we'll go back to when all Korea was invaded and colonized by imperialist Japan in 1910. Now, after seizing Korea, Japan became an ally of the U.S., Britain, and France in World War I. I didn't know that until I just read about it. They were an ally. After defeating Germany, these imperialists held a so-called peace conference in Paris. It was really meant to divide the spoils. But the conference was called in the name of, quote, self-determination as defined by US President Woodrow Wilson. The great revolutionary communist leader of Korea, Kim Il-sung, wrote a fascinating autobiography called Reminiscences with the Century. In it, he describes how bourgeois nationalists in Korea had pinned their hopes on Wilson and his so-called self-determination. But this is what Kim Il-sung had to say. Self-determination, in the sense that it was used in that conference, was a hypocritical slogan which the US imperialists put forward in order to reduce the influence of the October Socialist Revolution in Russia and lord it over the rest of the world. Under the deceptive slogan, the US imperialists schemed to undermine from within the multinational USSR and isolate small and weak colonial nations from one another to prevent them from uniting in the independence struggle. At the same time, they plotted to occupy the territory of those countries defeated in the war, unquote. And so it was for the Koreans, because what it meant for them was a continuation of Japanese colonial rule over the country. However, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 had strengthened those in the Korean movement for independence who had a class approach based on the workers and peasants. And one of them was Kim Il-sung's father. The autobiography of Kim Il-sung describes the many ways in which the revolutionaries in China, the USSR, and Korea all collaborated in the struggle to liberate their countries from imperialism. Many Korean exiles lived in China, and some lived in Siberia. During the 1920s and 30s, there was much going back and forth of the cadre in these movements, and they shared political views, organizing skills, and military training. By 1939, when the Second World War started, Japan had become an ally of Germany this time. The Soviet Union was fighting the fascists in both Europe and Asia. When Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945, it was just a matter of time before Japan would have to give in. Japan's defeat was seen by all Korean patriots as the opportunity to achieve true independence. And the Korean movement for independence by this time had been deeply influenced by both the Soviet victory and the ongoing Chinese Revolution. Those who based the struggle for national liberation on the workers and peasants eventually won out over the bourgeois nationalists. It was a communist liberation army led by Kim Il-sung and reinforced by troops from the Soviet Red Army that in 1945 marched into Korea from their bases in both China and the Soviet Union. They began to liberate the Korean working people from the Japanese colonial rulers and their Korean collaborators. As this liberation army moved south, it was greeted with tremendous support from the masses. One of its first moves was land reform, freeing the peasants from the hated landlords. Had they been able to continue their march, all Korea would have been liberated. But another huge imperialist power stood in the way. The US ruling class was determined to pick up the pieces of Japan's former empire, while containing the Soviet Union and sending a warning to the communists fighting to liberate China. The Truman administration rushed troops to the southern part of Korea. A US Army colonel, Dean Rusk, who later became Secretary of State, went to a map, drew a line on it, and divided Korea along the 38th parallel. That's how it got divided. While the foreign armies, with two foreign armies facing each other, it was agreed that US troops occupying the south and the Soviet troops in the north would leave in 3 years, letting the Korean people rule themselves. And the Soviet troops did leave in 1948. But the US troops are still there, and South Korea has been a US neo-colony ever since. Nearly 30,000 US troops occupy the South, despite much popular opposition. And the US carries out massive military exercises every year threatening the socialist DPRK. In the last few years, these exercises have included thousands of troops from Japan, the hated former colonial overlord. There is no longer a Soviet Union. However, many of the peoples in Russia, especially in the eastern part, sympathize with the socialist DPRK. And while the bourgeois elements that exist in China may want to appease the US for their own class reasons, the Communist Party leadership is not going along with Washington's plans for regime change in Korea. This small country has set a great example of courage in standing up to imperialism. Long live the DPRK, and long live People's China!